Thanks be to God. I was just about to do that. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me this morning. Like Karen said, my name is Ian Uriola, and I am currently serving as a chaplain down in Shenandoah University, down in Winchester, Virginia. If you take I-81 all the way south through Pennsylvania, through the little bit of Maryland and West Virginia, Winchester is the first exit north in Virginia. And I work there with our college students there. It's one of our United Methodist universities and institutions of higher education. But I'm a member of this annual conference with the United Methodists of Upper New York. I grew up in the Rochester area, and I'm still a member of Asbury First United Methodist Church out there. And I wear way too many hats in the annual conference and in our church leadership structure. But I right now am one of the delegates to General Conference, which will be meeting in Charlotte next April. So solicit your prayers for that. This entire summer, I've been traveling all around the East Coast, basically, doing different kinds of Methodist things, preaching at different churches, going to different annual conference sessions, working with different committees and task force and working groups. And I'm just really glad to have this church, this community, be a part of that journey for this summer. It's the last one before our students come back to school this Wednesday. So, we are going to dig in a little bit to the First Samuel text this morning. We'll get to the gospel passage at the very end. And I just would love it if we could open this time in prayer. Oh, come, Holy Spirit, come. Come, Almighty Spirit, come. Come, come, come. Amen. So as Sam alluded to a couple of weeks back, this story found in 1 Samuel is part of a much, much larger narrative. One of the challenges when it comes to the worship format, when it comes to proclaiming the word of the Lord, is that it's often so easy to look at any given scripture passage in isolation. We read this one story pulled out of its context in one larger book, and we expect it to do far more heavy lifting than it has any business doing in the first place on its own. It's a practice that does real violence to the text. And as it happens, when we do violence to the text like this, the text tends to punch back and do violence towards us and our communities. Another way to use the framework of Dr. Paloma Martinez Cruz of the Ohio State University, and I'm a University of Michigan fan, so if I'm quoting someone from the Ohio State University, you know it's got to be good. When we extract the text from its context, Dr. Martinez Cruz says, we are colonizing the text. Therefore, the act of adding context back into the text is necessarily the work of decolonizing the text. So yes, this story is part of a broader story being told in 1 Samuel. And the fact that we call it 1 Samuel means that this broader story has a direct sequel, 2 Samuel. As it happens, our Jewish siblings from whom we've inherited these texts don't separate the two books, actually, in their own devotional and liturgical practice, and instead treat them as one literary unit. And to take it a step further, our Jewish siblings also lump in Samuel with Joshua and Judges and Kings, or 1st and 2nd Kings to us Christians, to create the first major grouping of the second division of the Hebrew Bible. They're called the Nevi'im Rishonim, the former prophets. In a similar fashion, biblical scholars refer to these former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, as the Deuteronomistic history. Yet these are the fun bits of trivia that make me a real blast at dinner parties. Now that we've made a short story long, the main thrust of this is that this group of texts tell one cohesive story about the people of God's relationship with the land of Canaan. How the people came into the land, how they came to take possession of the land, how they lived and governed themselves in the land, and most importantly, how they lost the land and were taken into captivity. It's impossible to understand the full ramifications of anything in the Hebrew Bible without understanding the historical and generational trauma imparted on the people by the destruction of Jerusalem and exile into Babylon and its context thereof. For the sake of time, you can ask me about that for that lecture after the service. For the purposes of this sermon, we'll just say that the question on the mind of the people in the midst and wake of the Babylonian exile was, if we are the people of God, and God has promised us this land, why did we lose the land in the first place? The answer that the Deuteronomist, the hypothetical author that biblical scholars have proposed, wrote the Deuteronomistic history because biblical scholars are really good at naming things. The answer that the Deuteronomist and all of the other prophets thereafter came down on was basically, well, we screwed up. You know, we played stupid games, we won stupid prizes, we screwed around, and then we found out. My students would use a different word there, but in the interest of Sarah ever inviting me to come back to preach here, I'll let you fill in the blank. In particular, the Deuteronomist says, we screwed up by forsaking the covenant God laid out for us. We failed to care for the least of these in our midst, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant stranger, in favor of enriching ourselves, securing our own power and hoarding our own wealth. Thank God that we've all collectively progressed from such habits. So in very, very broad brushstrokes, that's what's going on in this story. That's what's going on around this story in 1 Samuel. It's part of this larger cautionary tale, explaining just why exactly the people lost the land that they had been promised. And when we read the story with this context in mind, some elements start to come into sharper focus. See, while there certainly is a pro-Davidic bent to the whole Deuteronomistic history, one of the key elements of this narrative, for example, is God making a covenant with David. that his descendants will always be sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. There is also a strong anti-monarchical streak preserved in the text as well. That is to say, the Deuteronomist is pretty suspicious of giving absolute power to one king. In fact, one of my favorite passages in this part of the Bible comes just a few chapters earlier in 1 Samuel 8. The elders of Israel approach Samuel and demand that he appoint a king to rule over Israel, just like all the other nations. Distraught, Samuel prays to God, who tells him not to worry. The people are rejecting God, not Samuel, after all, but to warn them about how a king will rule over them. And then Samuel delivers this fantastic speech, saying, okay, I'll give you a king, but all he's going to do is take your sons and conscript them to fight in his wars or to till his fields. He'll take your daughters to be his bakers and his cooks. He will take the fruits of your labor, your land, your vineyards, your crops, your flocks, and put them in his stores for his profit. And on that day, Samuel says, you will cry out to God because of the king that you chose for yourselves, but God will not answer you. Heavy stuff. Of course, because we know the end of the story, we know that the elders disregarded Samuel's warning. And so Samuel anointed Saul to be king over Israel. And well, if you were here for Sam's sermon a couple weeks ago, then you know how all of that turned out. But even beyond Saul, we're going to see king after king after king make the same mistakes in God's sight over and over again. Of the many, many kings between David and Jehoiakim, the Deuteronomist only gives like 3 or 4 an A rating. The vast majority of them will rule in such a way as to turn away from God in favor of foreign idols and rulers. They will rule in such a way as to secure their own power in expense of the well-being of the people God entrusted them to rule over. It's kind of a feature of absolute monarchies, not a bug. But what does any of this have to do with a covenant formed between David and Jonathan? Okay, zooming back into our story from this morning a little bit, we pick things up right after what might be one of the most well-known Bible stories of all time. Family Feud style, we pulled 100 people and asked them to name a story from the Bible. Top 5 answers are on the board. I'm willing to bet that the David and Goliath is up on that board. And while there's certainly a lot to unpack in that story, that's another sermon altogether. We'll just say that David is understandably riding pretty high when we first encounter him in our text this morning. And right away, we are told that Saul's son, Jonathan, that Jonathan's life was bound up in David's life. And Jonathan loved David as much as himself. Jonathan and David made a covenant together because Jonathan loved David as much as himself. It really is a lovely story and a lovely relationship. It's one of the strongest examples of a possibly queer relationship in our biblical witness. And if I were standing in any other church and preaching today on this text, we'd dive into that a little bit deeper, but come on. This is First Schenectady. I know that queer love is good and holy, and that God delights in queer relationships. We don't need to unpack that here. So instead, let's muddy the waters just a little bit and examine how exactly Jonathan makes his love visible. The very next verse, we're told that Jonathan took off the robe that he was wearing and put it on David, along with his armor, as well as his sword, his bow, and his belt. Jonathan takes off his own royal garments and he puts them on David. The Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, in her commentary on this text, tells us that this is a sign of Jonathan elevating David's status to that of himself. No longer a peasant shepherd boy, Jonathan giving David his clothing turns David into a prince like him. And I wonder if that, in and of itself, is the problem here. It's actually the second time that someone else puts royal garments on to David. The first time being during the story of David and Goliath, when Saul, the king, puts his own armor on David before he goes to fight the giant. It takes them off so that he can be nimbler in the battle. And yes, at first glance, it is a lovely gesture. I'm sure that someone somewhere could craft a beautiful liturgical element for a marriage ceremony, for example, involving the couple putting a piece of their own clothing on each other. But if we dig a little deeper, we'll find that this covenant that Jonathan is making with David is not exactly mutual. See, love, it turns out, is not one-sided. Love is not love if it is only flowing in one direction. Love, in its truest sense, transforms all parties in such a way as to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. One of the most dangerous lies that we've allowed to spread is the notion that any of us is incomplete until we found our one person who completes us, that we are somehow ontologically deficient until we find our soulmate. And in case anyone here is really struggling with the realities of living that single life and any loneliness that accompanies it, I want to affirm your pain. And just like we would say that the problem is societal structures, physical and otherwise, built in a way that makes living in disabled bodies hard, not the disability itself. The problem is that we've ordered our collective lives in such a way as to make living as a single person really, really challenging physically, economically, and emotionally. Jonathan took his royal garments and he put them on David. And in so doing, he showed his love for David by turning David into another version of himself. It's a sign that David, on his own and as he was not enough for Jonathan. For this covenant to work, Jonathan made David join him in the ranks of the monarchy. Jonathan made David wear the trappings of the monarchy, never mind the fact that David, a shepherd boy and the youngest of Jesse's sons, was good enough in God's sight to receive the king's anointing. Never mind the fact that David was able to slay Goliath on his own terms rather than the established rules of war and combat. David was able to do all of that and receive God's blessing without any royal garments at all. But Jonathan loved David more than himself, so clearly David needed to become a royal like Jonathan. And what ends up happening with King David? Sure, the Deuteronomistic history has a pro-Davidic bent to it, but also the total picture of David's life and reign that the Deuteronomist preserves is not flattering, to say the least. After he rapes Bathsheba and kills Uriah, his family falls apart, racked with internal strife and civil war. In one of the last times that we encounter him before his death, the Deuteronomist tells us that David is left politically and sexually impotent. Many scholars will say that David's downfall begins after he rapes Bathsheba, but I contend that the seeds of his downfall were planted all the way back at this moment. Jonathan showing his love for him by thrusting the monarchy and its politics and its logic upon him. I'll give you a king, Samuel warned, but all he's going to do is take and take and take. In order for this covenant to work, in order for this love to work, Jonathan said, I'm going to make you look and act and behave like the king we were promised. But another way, Jonathan made David in his own image, rather than loving David as the bearer of the divine image of God that he already was. How often is that how we end up showing love, even still to this day? Trying to form the people we seek to love in our image, rather than loving them as the bearer of the divine image they already are. And I don't just mean romantic love here, though we've all seen enough tragic relationships where that was at play. We also see this play out in dysfunctional family systems with familial love, parents projecting their own lived experience on children and vice versa. Jonathan learned this behavior from somewhere, after all. But when we look closely, we also see it play out in many other types of relationships, systems, and structures. We see it play out in educational systems, wherein students are viewed as blank slates, tabulae rasa, or empty vessels that the instructor pours all of their own knowledge into. We see it play out in marketing and commerce, advertising campaigns preying on our collective insecurities and vulnerabilities to mold us into the consumers they need us to be. We see it play out in conferences and events where information only flows in one direction in a tightly controlled and manufactured manner. We see it play out in conversations about racial advocacy. Well, I don't care what race anybody is, just so long as they don't act like a thug. We see it play out in conversations about LGBTQ advocacy, when the extent of our advocacy stops at merely letting queer relationships participate in the same heteronormative institutions that straight couples get to participate in. And oh boy, do we see it play out in service agencies and in churches. We seek to serve our communities, but we're going to do it on our terms in a way that makes us feel better. We'll give charitably, but only if the places we give to meet our expectation of what the work ought to look like. No wonder evangelism has such a bad reputation. For so long, evangelistic efforts can basically be boiled down to, hey, I have it all figured out because I have Jesus and you don't, and so you should be like me. Really, it's a way to keep the ones we seek to be in covenant with at arm's length, to control them, to prevent us from being in real, loving relationship with them. Because when we seek to mold others in our own likeness, we don't really have to get to know them. We don't have to be vulnerable. And hey, if the student fails or the addict relapses, well then, that's their problem, not mine. But it doesn't have to be that way. Love calls us to go deeper. Love calls us to be vulnerable. Love calls us to embrace the messiness of real relationships. Love calls us to recognize that Christ stands in the midst of every single social relationship, and that encountering Christ requires going beyond ourselves. It's what our gospel says this morning. When we enter into covenant with someone, let our yes be yes and our no be no. That's it. Not, yes, but only if you act like us. Not, yes, only if you talk like us. Not, yes, only if you look or love or think like us. Not, yes, but put on these royal garments, binding you to the ways of living and being of the kind of king Samuel warned us about. Let our yes be yes and our no be no. Imagine if that's the posture that Jonathan took with David. Imagine what the trajectory of Israel's future could have been. That's the cautionary tale that the Deuteronomist is telling throughout the Deuteronomistic history, throughout the Nevi'im Rishonim. The good news, my friends, is that we can read these cautionary tales to fuel our own prophetic imagination in our own time and in our own place. So may we be secure enough in our own selves that we don't try to grasp for power. May we be secure enough in our own selves that we don't make promises that we know we can't keep. May we be secure enough in our own selves that we don't try to form the ones we seek to be in relationship in our own image, that we don't force them to put on the robes that we wear. May it be so.